wrote the book of Hebrews in order to prevent them from leaving Christ and going back into Judaism. So the message of Hebrews is to maintain your faith. Stay faithful under any and all conditions. So you might imagine if that's really what the book is written for, then it would be a very good book to read and study and to think about when we meet trials and tribulations in this life that cause us to want to forsake Christ and to give it up and say, what's the use? I just can't make it. So this book was written to prevent that from happening. And when we think that the writer was inspired by God, what we have here are God's thoughts in giving us reasons as to why we should maintain our faith. These are God's reasons. These are what his arguments would be to keep us faithful. And of course we know that God, being perfect and knowing exactly how we think, is going to give us the information that we would need in order to maintain our faith. So it's here. We've got it. This book is here. All we need to do is read and study it and to understand what the message is that it contains. And that's the purpose of this class, is to try to get that message out. And in fact, in my preparation for this study, and I've been on it about a year and a half, this is the reason I want us to go back to Romania. Because I've got a list of probably 75 or 80 names of people that obeyed the gospel when we were over there that had become unfaithful. And I want to go back and talk to those people face to face about what I've learned in this book. Because if they won't listen to that, if that won't bring them back, there's not anything that'll bring them back. And I just think some of them will come back, will repent, because they don't know. They don't know what God has said. And this is really, our lack of knowledge is the root source of our problems in Christ, is lack of knowledge. This is the reason I'm convinced in my mind that the Apostle Paul could not be deterred. He had been to paradise. He'd seen and heard things that he couldn't say. He knew what it was. I'm not saying he knew all about it, but he at least he was exposed to it in a way that we have never been and won't be until we get there. And having seen and heard what he saw and heard, what could you do to deter him? Nothing. He wasn't going to be deterred. In fact, that's the reason he expressed in the Philippian letter that he wanted to leave this life so he could be with Christ. We're with Christ in a way in this life, but we're not with him in the way that we will be there. And Paul knew that. That's what he had experienced, but he couldn't tell us about it because he couldn't describe it. It was indescribable. And that right there tells you that it's got to be wonderful, because we can understand a lot of things. We've got good minds. But there are things that we can't understand. They're beyond our ability to understand. And that's what eye hath not seen, ear hath not heard, nor has it entered the heart of man, the things that God has prepared for who? For those that love him. And that's what Paul had seen. He had seen some of these things. And so if we knew these things like he knew them, we couldn't be deterred either. There's not anything on earth that could keep us from being faithful. if we knew that. And I think this is the advantage of studying this book, is because it gives us a lot of reasons that we can understand as to why we should maintain our faith. And if you'll look over this outline from time to time and bring it with you to class and follow along in it, you'll see the arguments that are presented, and you can understand how they're developed. And this outline, I think I've told you there that it's from Lenski's commentary, and in fact, many of my comments are from his commentary. I studied his commentary diligently, and I think I've weeded out all the false doctrine in it, and there's quite a bit. And that's one thing it's hard to understand, is how someone so educated and such an expert in languages can be so wrong on some things. But I think a lot of it is his allegiance to his church. He had a reputation among the Lutherans and among his people, and he was really put up on a pedestal and really was given a lot of fame and glory. And when you turn against that, you give all that up. Think of the fame and glory that Paul had among the Pharisees. But he says, those things that were gained to me, I counted as dung for the knowledge of Christ my Lord. There wasn't anything this earth had to offer that would keep Paul's allegiance to that, if it meant his unfaithfulness to Christ. Because there was no comparison. His unfaithfulness to Christ, his faithfulness to Christ was on such a high level, nothing else could even come close to it. And this is, if we can get this message, then we won't allow anything to deter us either. That's not beyond our control. Now, there's some things that, Paul was in prison for 4 years, and he could not assemble with the saints. Couldn't do it. He was on that ship going to Rome in fact, for 2 weeks they didn't eat anything. 14 days. There was such a storm. And he couldn't assemble with the saints. But guess what he did on that ship? I bet he converted every soul on there. And Luke even tells us how many was on it. 200 and something. And God gave them all to Paul. So we can see that, just because we can't physically assemble, mentally we can be with the saints. And it's like Paul told Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 5, he says, even though I'm not with you in body, I'm with you in spirit. When you come together, get rid of that man. I'm with you in spirit. And whatsoever you do to him, I'm doing it too. And spiritually we can do that. And we can be. This is one of the wonderful things about the family of God. It's a spiritual family. And we can sit right here and be with our brethren all over the world in spirit. And that's good.
That's what John said on the Isle of Patmos. He couldn't, there was no church there, I'm sure. But he said he was in the spirit on the Lord's Day.
Exactly.
He knew what day was the Lord's Day.
Yeah.
I don't know how long he'd been there.
Yeah.
But
So it's a wonderful thing. Like Jesus told the woman at the well, you worship in this mountain, but the days are coming when the true worshiper will worship God in what? Truth. In spirit and in truth. We can worship God in spirit anywhere we are. we cannot be prevented from worshiping God in spirit. It don't matter where we are. You shall know the truth shall make you free. I mean, we're free. And we cannot be bound. The only thing that binds us is what?
Ourselves.
Sin. That's the only thing that'll bind us. And if we'll stay with it, we won't be bound. We'll be free indeed. Jesus says that and if the truth make you free, you'll be free indeed. Okay, so we got down to talking about the author of this book. We don't know who it is. And we mentioned in our first lesson some of the things that people believe. I'm not going to go back into that. But there's a couple of reasons as to why the Apostle Paul is not the author of this book. And I used to believe, I believed for years and years and years that Paul was the author, but the first reason I'm going to give you is that there's just not a good place in his lifetime where you could put this book where he wrote it. Because the book was written about 68. It was written after Rome burned, but before Jerusalem was destroyed. Paul was released from prison in 62, and he had plans. After he was released from prison, he wanted to go somewhere. You remember where that was?
Stephanie said Spain.
Yeah, he wanted to go to Spain. And I believe he did. I believe he went to Spain. That's what he wanted to do, and if it was the Lord's will, and he was released in 62, and he went to Spain, he did his thing there. We don't have any history of that. And then he came back through Cyprus and Crete, and he dropped Titus off in Crete, and he come on up into Asia Minor and Ephesus, and Timothy was left there, and he come on over into Macedonia, up through Greece into Macedonia, and was rearrested. And this time, he was put to death. So, somebody says, well, couldn't he have written the book of Hebrews in prison? Yeah, he probably could. He wrote a lot of letters in prison. But this time when he was rearrested and tried, they didn't waste any time on him because Rome had burned in June of 64. Nero was blamed. Nero tried to deflect the blame because it was a very serious thing. I mean, most of the city was burned. But he wanted to build a big track, a big circus track for the chariot races and all this. And the only problem was there were houses there. And Gene and I saw this when we were in Rome, and we saw this huge area that's still vacant today where that track was, and parts of it still are there. Well, you couldn't build that track with them houses on it. So what you going to do? Well, if you're emperor, you're going to make some arrangements with a bunch of people, and you're going to leave the country, and they're going to set fire to the city, and they're going to burn all that. And that's exactly what happened. And he was out of the city. Why do you suppose he's out of the city?
He won't be blamed.
Yeah, he didn't want to be blamed because everybody knew what he wanted to do, and they wouldn't let him. Even though he was emperor, he was going to have an uprising on his hand because this was most of the city that was burned. I don't think he intended for that much of it to be burned, but when you got houses, you just barely can walk between them. They're all made out of wood and stuff. One catch fire, the rest of it's going to catch fire, and that's what happened. It burned for 4 or 5 days.
Doesn't history
Pardon
have it doesn't history have it that Nero played the fiddle while Rome burned?
Yeah, that's what they
That's what I've always heard.
Yeah, well,
It may not be
that's
true.
more or less a little phrase that come from that, you know. He played the fiddle while Rome burned. Of course, that meant he was happy that this happened.
And he was actually out of town. He
Yeah,
wasn't
and
there.
he was happy. So, this was in June of '64, and I don't know, it took probably 3 or 4 months for the accusations against him built up to the point that he started looking around for a scapegoat. What's a scapegoat?
Take the ball for you.
Yeah, somebody that you can blame and get away with it. And the Christians were such a people. And we went into this why, the first lesson. We won't go into it today, as to why the Roman population were so quick to shift the blame from Nero to the Christians. And as a result of this, the Christians in Rome became under severe persecution, starting probably in late '64 or early '65, and went on for '65 and '66, maybe even into '67. Thousands of them were burned and killed every which way. There was no imaginable way that you could kill a person that they didn't do it. And Fox's Book of Martyrs goes into a lot of this, and it's a terrible thing. And when we studied Revelation letter, you remember we went into this quite a bit. But the Christians were a good scapegoat for Nero because the Roman population didn't like them. They were afraid of them. And they believed so many false things about them that they were really afraid of the Christians. So I think Wednesday night we went into about 6 or 8 reasons as to why they were afraid of them. But anyway, they were a good scapegoat. Now, when we say the Christians in Rome at that time, we're talking about the congregations that Paul wrote to when he wrote the Roman letter. And if you read Romans 16, you see there's at least 4 or 5 different congregations of those people that were called the church in Rome, even though they met in different households. And Paul salutes those of the household of Aristobulus and the household of others there. And these are different congregations, but these are the original Christians in Rome that nobody knows, God knows, how they began. They probably began from Acts 2 when those people came back who heard the gospel because there were Romans there. If you read in Acts 2, the nations that were present. And they came back to Rome and started worshiping and just multiplied. Even some of Caesar's household became Christians. And then Paul didn't get to Rome until 62. He wrote them about 57 and told them, I want to come. He says, pray for me that I'll have a good trip. Well, he finally came. Oh, no, he came in 60, not 62. He was released in 62. He came in 60. But did he have a good trip? We wouldn't say it was a good trip. His shipwrecked and snake bit. But he finally got there. And when he came into 3 taverns and Happy Forum down below Rome, some brethren went down there to meet him, and he was just elated to see those brethren. But Paul had gotten such respect and high regard by the Roman centurion and the Roman soldiers that he was treated almost as a free person. He was still a prisoner, but they let him do what he wanted to do. He come and went because they trusted him. He had earned that trust. And even when he got to Rome, Luke tells us that he lived in his own rented house. And he was able to receive people that could come and go as they wanted to. Well, that's when he converted these people that Hebrews is written to. These people were Jews. All of them. And they lived in one place. We know that from reading the letter. We know that they were a body of Jews who became Christians, and they lived in one geographical locality. And there's no other group besides Palestine that fits this. And these would not be in Palestine when this letter was written in 68. What happened in Palestine in 70?
Right.
Huh?
Destruction of Jerusalem.
Yeah, Jerusalem was destroyed. In fact, Jerusalem was under siege twice. The first time, Vespasian put it under siege, and then Nero was killed, so he lifted the siege and he went back to Rome and became emperor, and his son Titus came back and renewed the siege. Well, during the time that the siege stopped and it renewed, the Christians got out. Because Jesus had told them, when you see the abomination of desolation standing where it should not be, flee. Don't even go back into your house to get anything. Get out. Woe to the women that are with child, and woe to this and then to that one. Why? Because they couldn't flee. But Jesus warned, and this is when John the Apostle left Jerusalem and come to Ephesus, which released Timothy, whom Paul had left at Ephesus. And so we see this then, that these Christians got out of Rome, of Jerusalem, and which happened in 70, but the book of Hebrews being written in 68, and we'll talk a little bit more about who wrote it here in just a moment. I forgot the point I was making. But anyway, Paul, it seems, would not have had time to write it in his itinerary that he was doing. Correct?
Your point is why it couldn't be Palestine and had to be Rome.
Okay, and these Christians that had fled Palestine, when Hebrews was written in 68, they were already being under siege by Vespasian, and it just does not fit, because these people here to whom this is written, and in fact, if you look at Hebrews 12 verse 4, he says, you have not yet resisted unto blood, against striving against sin. What does that tell us?
They have been persecuted like that.
Yeah, their persecution was not so severe as to kill them. You couldn't say that about the original congregation in Rome, because they were being put to death right and left ever since Nero blamed the Christians either late 64 or early 65. They'd been killed by the thousands. So that verse, Hebrews 12 and verse 4, could not be written to the original church in Rome, because they had resisted unto blood, striving against sin. So, but these Christians here were suffering persecution. This is the impetus of their wanting to leave Christ and go back to Judaism, because the Romans looked at the Jews as Jews, and the Romans had even passed laws giving the Jews the right to worship their God according to the law of Moses. So the Romans weren't persecuting the Jews. And these Jews, if they were converted by Paul, beginning in 60, because he was a prisoner there for 2 years, 60 through 62, and then he was released. So Paul during that time lived in a rented house, and people were free to come and go as they pleased. And if you read Luke 28, where Luke says that when he first got to Rome, he met with the Jewish leaders who told Paul, we've heard of the way, but we haven't heard any bad thing about you. We'd like to know more about this way. What is that way they're talking about?
Gospel of Christ.
Yeah, the Christians. We've heard about them, but we don't know much about it. We'd like to know more about it. And so Paul set a date and time, and they came, and they were converted. About 50% of them became Christians. So these people then, since they became Christians in 60, and if it was written in 68, they'd only been Christians 8 years. Whereas the old original congregation had been Christians, we don't even know how long they'd been Christians. Probably starting back in the when Christ died, when he was put to death, after about 3 years after he was put to death in 33, some of these people started becoming Christians because the church had to have started from those in Acts 2 who heard the gospel preached by Peter the first time. Those people come back to Rome and they began worshiping and the church started. So you've got these Christians, we call them Gentile Christians, but they had a Jewish nucleus because the Jews and then the God-fearing Gentiles who were proselytes were converted. And then after 36, when the household of Cornelius was converted, and by 40 the Gentiles was being preached, and Paul became the apostle to the Gentiles about 47, 48. And so we see that from that time, the Gentiles became Christians by the droves, just by the thousands. In fact, so many of them, it made the Jews jealous. This is one thing that caused the Jews to become enemies of Christ, is when they saw in Antioch of Pisidia, the whole city of Gentiles come together, and they wanted to hear what Paul and Barnabas had to say. The Jews became so jealous that they turned against it. And that's where Paul says, seeing that you blaspheme against Christ, lo, we turn to the Gentiles. And that was about 47 AD. So you figure here now, from 47 to 68, we got what, 21 years? 21 years for that Roman people, the Roman church, the original church there to grow and flourish. And Paul wrote Rome about 57. And now we're about 68 when this is written. But look what he says in Hebrews 10, 32 through 34 concerning these Christians, these Jewish Christians, or these Jews who became Christians. He says, recall the former days. Now the former days for them refers back to when? When they first became Christians, which would be when? If it's the Jews in Rome.
Probably Acts 2.
Huh?
Probably Acts 2.
No, this is the Jewish, this is not the original. This is the Jewish group. What's the former days for them? How did they become Christians? I just went through
They
it.
were in Jerusalem.
Huh?
They were at Jerusalem when the church.
No,
was
these are a different group.
They were in Rome.
There's two groups of Christians in Rome. There's the original congregation that Paul wrote to, and there's this group that Hebrews is written to. They're different. What's the difference? You've got to know this. If you don't know it, you're not going to understand Hebrews.
They were-
Why is this called Hebrews?
Because it's addressed to the Hebrews.
Who's the Hebrews?
The Jews.
Jews
So these are the
and
ones that he
Greeks.
converted in the synagogues when he went there? Is that what you're suggesting?
These are the ones that Paul converted as a prisoner. that come to his hired house. These are the ones, and there were, I wasn't going to go back into all this because we had it Wednesday night, but there were 7 synagogues in Rome. About half of them were converted, according to Luke. So that means at least 3 of those synagogues became places for Christians to meet. So in Hebrews 10, 32 and 33, he says, recall the former days. So what's the former days for them?
Before they were converted.
Yeah, or when they were converted. That's at the very first part of their time. After you were enlightened, what's that?
That's when they were converted.
That's when they were converted. You endured hard struggles with sufferings, sometimes being publicly exposed to reproach and affliction, and sometimes being partners with those so treated. Now, this writer here, inspired, is saying that they indeed suffered persecution, but we've already noted, not unto what?
Death or blood.
Not unto blood. They were persecuted, but not to death, which tells us it's a different group than the original group. Okay? Now, he says, sometimes being publicly exposed to reproach or affliction, sometimes being partners with those so treated. Now, who are the partners that they were partners with?
Gentile Christians.
Yeah, that's the other group of Christians in Rome. These Jewish Christians had not suffered unto death, but they were publicly exposed, and they were partners to those who had suffered unto death. So how do you suppose that these Jewish Christians were partners to those others?
In the one spirit. I mean, in the fact that they're Christians and they're a target.
Exactly. They sympathized with them, didn't they? They sympathized with them. And they probably tried to shield them to some extent. Because he says here, you were partners with them. For you had compassion on those in prison. And you joyfully accepted the plundering of your property. What does that mean?
Economic hardship.
Yeah. As the Roman state confiscated physical possessions from these people who were sympathetic to the Jews, to the Christians that they were killing, because they sympathized with them, they had some of their possessions taken from them. Can't you just see that happening? I mean, if you sympathize with somebody like that, then the people who are enemies of these Christians are going to kind of put you in the same boat, but in their eyes, you're still a Jew. You're not a Christian. If you were a Christian too, guess what they'd do? Yeah, they'd kill you. But they didn't know. The Romans didn't know that these Jews, why? Because they worshiped in the synagogue, the building. They lived together. They chummed together. They worked together. And in their eyes, they were Jews. And they were kind of left alone. But they weren't really 100% left alone. They were still persecuted because they sympathized with these Christians over here that they knew were not Jews. So, we see then how these people, 2 different groups in Rome, how they were kind of, in the eyes of the Roman citizens, isolated from the true Christians, well, they were both true Christians, from the original Christians. And we need to keep these 2 groups in mind, because the book of Hebrews is addressed to the former Jews in order to prevent them from leaving Christ and going back to Judaism. Now, keep in mind all that I've said, what would be the motivation for these Jewish Christians to leave Christ and go back to Judaism? Why do that?
Persecution.
Pardon me?
Persecution.
Yeah, because they wouldn't be persecuted. The only reason they were persecuted is because they sympathized with these Christians. So if they divorce themselves from Christ, you know, they could get by without sympathy. But if you're a Christian, can you ignore the sufferings of your brethren? You can't do it. Not and be a Christian. So, these Jews are smart. They get together and they say, this thing's going to it's getting worse and worse. It's going to get to the point that they're going to come kill us too. We worship God before we become Christians. Let's go back and worship Him again that way. Jerusalem's not destroyed yet. They could do that. They still had the temple, the altar, the priesthood. They had all that. They could go back into Judaism. Now, if you were in their shoes, how tempting would that be? I mean, you never know when you're going, hey, open up. And those Romans didn't mess around.
But if you truly believed and you truly knew that truth and believed it, you just couldn't do it.
Do what now?
If they were true Christians and
Yeah.
really understood, they still couldn't do that. They couldn't go back to the...
That's right. That's what this letter's about. And this writer is going to give reason after reason after reason as to why Christianity is better than Judaism. And we know, and they knew, that Judaism was better than what?
And death.
Than paganism.
Yeah.
I mean, you got paganism, you got Judaism, and you got Christianity. And we're going to see that. And they knew that Judaism was so much better than anything the world had until Christ came. And now he's going to tell them that Christianity is so much better than Judaism was of paganism, that there's not even a race. There's no contest. And this book will tell us and show us and prove to us that there is nothing on earth that can even compare with the body of Christ, which is what?
The Lord's church.
Which is the church. There's nothing close to it. It is unique. We're either for Christ or we're against Christ. There's no middle ground. And these arguments that are going to be presented in this book prove this from the very first verse. I mean, he doesn't even waste any time. He doesn't even have a salutation. He just jumps right in to the purpose for his book in telling us what God has done for us in Christ. There's nothing like it. And I think we'll see as we go through and study this that you talk to people, your friends, your loved ones, that, you know, Christianity, yeah, it's good, it's all right. They have no idea They just do not know. Ignorance. It's like Paul says, and in many of his prayers, he prays that God will enlighten the mind that they may understand what God has done for us. If we could just understand that, there's no way, nothing that can happen to pull us away from Christ. There's nothing that has that power. And that's what we're going to be studying about in this book. Now, let me give you a reason as to why Paul could not be the author. And that's in chapter 2, verse 3. This one verse proves that there's just no way that Paul could have written Hebrews. How shall we escape if we neglect so great salvation, which at the first began to be spoken by the Lord, and was confirmed unto us by them that heard him? Now the writer here is writing in the first person plural. He's including himself in the group of those he's writing to. I'm one of you. How shall we escape? He don't say, how can you escape? He's putting himself in with them. There's no escape for anybody if we neglect. He didn't say if you refuse to believe. He just says if you neglect. What does neglect mean?
Ignore it.
Huh?
Ignore it.
Don't live it full-heartedly. Don't
Yeah,
commit yourself
exactly.
to it.
You're not 100% involved in it. I mean, if you neglect it, you're kind of wishy-washy. It's there. You're indifferent, you know. Are you a Christian? Yeah. You're going to go to church Sunday? I may not.
I don't see how this proves, though.
Huh?
I don't see how this proves that Paul didn't write it.
We're not there yet,
Okay.
okay?
I'll be patient.
We're talking about the verse. If we neglect this salvation, if we just kind of push it over aside and, you know, it's about 90% of my life. Can you be a 90% Christian? You can't even be a 99% Christian, can you? Not be a Christian. What if Christ had been only 99% Son of God?
I think Jimmy Christ puts it in Revelation where it says, if you're lukewarm, I'll spew you out of your mouth.
Yeah, anything less than 100% is lukewarm, isn't it, Brother Paul? Lukewarm, indifference. If we neglect, how shall we escape if we neglect? That's the question he's asking. Now he's going to tell us something about this salvation that we could neglect. There's a possibility that we could neglect it. What salvation are you talking about? I'm talking about that salvation which was first preached by the Lord. What salvation was that?
The gospel while he was here on earth.
That's the gospel he preached while he's here on earth. Did he preach two different gospels? 3, 4, 5? I mean, he preached one gospel. That's the one. If we neglect that one, the one that he preached, how shall we escape? That right there, what does that do to everything else? I mean, I don't care what, so-called church you're a member of. If you don't obey the gospel that the Lord preached, how can you escape? But he didn't stop there. He defines it further. It's not just the gospel that the Lord preached, but it's also the gospel that was confirmed unto who? Unto us. By who? By them that heard him. Who's him?
Jesus.
Jesus. Who heard Jesus?
These apostles, for
The
sure.
apostles. They're the ones that heard Jesus, and they're the ones that confirmed this gospel to who?
To them.
To us. Question. Did Saul of Tarsus hear the gospel from Christ?
He did. Well, no, he didn't.
Okay, no.
But he did later on. After he
No.
was converted.
This is while Jesus was on earth. Did he hear the gospel from Christ? Is this the way Paul learned the gospel?
No,
No. He didn't learn it that way. He didn't get it that
he
way.
didn't even learn it on the road to Damascus.
In fact, this gospel that Christ taught was the one who was confirmed unto these Hebrews that he's writing to, including him, by whom? Who confirmed this gospel that Christ preached to these Hebrews, including the writer?
Through the apostles.
The apostles. That, which apostles? There were 16, I think, or 15. I used to know exactly.
Well, it would be Paul and whoever was with Paul at the time.
Yeah, but which apostles heard the Lord?
The 12.
12.
Yeah,
12 apostles are.
The 13, if you.
and Matthias too, because he accompanied the Lord. But Paul didn't hear the Lord. And Paul could not have been one of these that confirmed this gospel unto these Hebrews. He could not have been. Because Paul got the gospel a different way. Look at Galatians 1, 11 and 12. Paul says, I make known unto you, brethren, he's writing to the churches in Galatia now, as touching the gospel which was preached by me. He's being very specific. This is the gospel that Paul preached. He says, it is not after man. What does that mean?
It didn't come from man. He wasn't taught by man.
Yeah, it didn't come from man. This gospel I preached, it didn't come from man. For neither did I receive it from man, nor was I taught it. But he's going to tell us now how it did come to him. It came to me through revelation of Jesus Christ. I used to, I'd sit and I'd work 15, 20 hours on a sermon. I think of this. Man, the Apostle Paul didn't even have to study to preach. He didn't study. He didn't have to. He just got up and started talking. Why?
Because he
Of
knew.
the Spirit.
Yeah. This was Christ preaching right through him. It was revealed to him. Revelation is the process by which Paul come to know the gospel. It was revealed to him. Now, I'm not saying that he didn't write down and study what he wrote later. I'm sure he did, because he asked Timothy to come by Troas and bring him the books. Well, that could be in the Old Testament books, may have been. But anyway, Paul was inspired.
But the other apostles didn't have to study either. It was revealed to them just like on the day of Pentecost.
Yeah, but they received it from the Lord, didn't they, first?
Well, even the Lord showed his frustration because they weren't getting his teaching.
So what we're showing here is that the Apostle Paul, the gospel that he was given to him was revealed to him, whereas the others, parts of it were and parts of it weren't. Parts of it were learned from the Lord as they heard him. But look at Ephesians 2, 2 and 3. We got this other scripture. Ephesians 2, 2 and 3. He says, I assume that you've heard of the stewardship of God's grace that was given to me for you. So Paul is letting these Ephesian brethren know,
What verse was that?
Yeah,
Ephesians 3 and verse 2.
Okay.
What did I say?
Two.
Ephesians 2:2.
Okay, Ephesians 3 and verse 2. It was given to me for you, he says, how the mystery was made known unto me by revelation. Now, the mystery is the gospel of Christ, and this word mystery was used to apply to the gospel because, if you remember back over in 1 Peter 1, verses 7, 8, 9, and 10, the prophets and the wise men of old time desired to see these things. In fact, they searched what manner of time and how this would be fulfilled. It was a mystery to them. They didn't know. But the things they prophesied about, Peter says, were ministered to us. The things that they said were for us. So they couldn't, Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Malachi and those prophets, they prophesied about the Messiah and about the message he was going to bring. And they wanted to know more about it. And as you remember, back in Daniel about 9, 10, and 11, Daniel was just in a trance, wanting to know, and God sent the angel to him and says, these things are sealed up. They're for a later time. So Daniel couldn't know them. And Daniel was a man that, God treated Daniel very specially because he was a special believer. Went into Babylonian captivity as a young'un, about 10, 11, 12 years old. Stayed there his whole life, serving God. Served about 3 different kings, found empires. But it was kept from him. But Paul says here in Ephesians 2, he says, how that the mystery was made known unto me by revelation, as I have written briefly. He says, and when you read this, verse 4, when you read this what? What is this? Yeah, when you read what I'm writing you, you can perceive my insight into the mystery of Christ. Now, how can we know what Paul knew?
Through his writing, he says.
By studying his writings. By studying what he wrote. It was revealed to him. It's not going to be revealed to us. We're going to have to read and study what he wrote, and we'll come to understand what he knew. How the mystery is made known to me by revelation, as I've written before. When you read this, you can perceive my insight into the mystery of Christ, which was not made known to the sons of men in other generations. Which here is the demonstrative pronoun referring back to this mystery. This mystery was not made known to the sons of men in other generations, as it has now been revealed to his who? Holy apostles and prophets by who? The Spirit. You see. So, this is the first time God has made this known. And Paul was writing this Ephesian letter probably about 61 that he wrote. He was a prisoner when he wrote it. Wrote Ephesians, Colossians, and Philemon probably the same day or the same period of time. So we see here that Paul could not have written the Hebrews letter. Anybody have any comment or question on that? Okay. We quit at 10 o'clock.
Yes.
We got about 3 minutes, and I don't want to get into who did write it, but I guess I'll have to. I don't want to waste that time. It seems the single most suited person available that we know something about that could have written this letter was Apollos. Arguments in favor of Apollos being the author of Hebrews is, and I've got 9 reasons here. I'm just going to read them to you, and we may discuss them more Wednesday night. First, he was an Alexandrian Jew. And Alexandria was a learning center in Roman times. It had one of the greatest libraries in the world. He was very eloquent, and he knew the Old Testament scriptures. Acts 18 verse 24 says, and a certain Jew named Apollos, born at Alexander, an eloquent man, mighty in the scriptures, came to Ephesus. What scriptures is he talking about here? He was mighty in the
The
scriptures,
Old Testament.
the Old Testament scriptures. Now, Acts was written about 52. So it would be about, well, Acts was written later than 52. It's about 52 that Apollos came to Ephesus. About 52. Now the Greek, here's the third reason. The Greek that's used in writing Hebrews is probably the best Greek in all the New Testament. It is superb. And there's just, and we'll point this out as we go through the exposition of the scriptures, that not only are the words the exact word needed to convey the thought, but the tenses of the verbs are just perfect. And they reveal so much to us. The tenses of the verbs and the tenses of the participles, which we call a gerund, an ing word, having, seeing, believing, or these are processes. These are what we call the participles. They're just perfect. And I see our time's up, so we'll quit here with number 3. We'll go back into this Wednesday night, Lord's willing, and pick this up. Any final comment before we close class? All right. Thank you very much for your participation in class.